Did you know that power outages increase reports of paranormal activity by almost 40%? Imagine being plunged into darkness, with only the silence and a creeping sense of dread to keep you company. Have you ever experienced a blackout in the dead of night? Tonight, we're diving into stories of terror that happened in the pitch black of night, when power failed and fear crept in. These are tales that will make you dread the next time the lights go out and maybe make you question what's really lurking in the dark. Blackouts can be unnerving, even in the comfort of your own home. The flicker of lights going out, the deepening silence, and the realization that you're isolated in total darkness stirs something primal within us. For most, it's a minor inconvenience, but for a few unfortunate souls, a blackout becomes the beginning of a nightmare. Picture this: you're home alone. The night is quiet, and suddenly everything is engulfed in darkness. Your phone's low on battery. Your flashlight isn't where you left it, and the shadows seem to thicken around you. It's then that you realize just how vulnerable you are, surrounded by nothing but silence and the unknown. Story 1. The Stalker in the Dark. Emily was studying late one night when a storm swept through her town, cutting the power. At first, it was just annoying. She'd have to wait for her laptop to reboot once the power came back. But as she lit a candle, she noticed something unsettling. A figure standing on the street outside, just barely visible from her second-floor window. She tried to brush it off as a passerby, maybe a neighbor looking out into the night, but then she saw it move closer. The person seemed to be watching her. Her stomach churned as she realized they had no flashlight, no reason to be there at that hour, in that pitch-black silence. She moved away from the window, but every time she glanced out, the figure had moved closer. First, to the base of her driveway, then to her front yard. She wanted to call the police, but her phone was dead. She stayed hidden, counting her breaths until the lights suddenly flickered back on. She ran to the window, expecting to see an empty yard. But instead, she was greeted by a pair of eyes staring up from directly below the window, so close she could see the whites of them in the dim light. Then, as quickly as the power had returned, it cut out again. In the momentary dark, she heard the creak of her front porch steps. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her door rattling, as though someone were testing it to see if it was unlocked. The next morning, the police found only a muddy handprint on the door and a note scribbled in messy handwriting. "I saw you. Story 2. The Haunting Silence." Ben was working the night shift at an old hospital during a blackout. In an empty, barely lit corridor, the silence became oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional hum of emergency generators. Ben and his co-worker Susan were alone in the hallway, using their flashlights to guide them as they did rounds. As they passed the surgical wing, Ben thought he heard soft humming. He paused, thinking maybe one of the staff had stayed behind, but Susan didn't seem to notice. He listened closer and realized it was an old lullaby, the kind his grandmother used to sing. When he looked up, he saw a shadow move across the window of the operating room door like someone passing through. "Susan," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Did you see that?" She nodded slowly, her face pale. Together, they opened the door, only to find an empty room. But then a faint voice drifted from behind them. "Come play with me." It was a child's voice echoing in the empty hall. They bolted, but as they reached the exit, the emergency lights flickered and dimmed. In the last moments of light, Ben swore he saw the outline of a little girl standing at the end of the hall, watching them. The lights went out, and when they flickered back on, she was gone. Story 3: The Ghost in the Basement. Julia had just moved into a new apartment when she experienced her first blackout. It was unsettling, especially since she was still unfamiliar with the building. After fumbling around for her flashlight, she decided to check the circuit breaker, which was located in the basement. As she descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and an eerie stillness settled around her. She reached the bottom and scanned the basement with her flashlight. There, standing against the far wall, was a figure. Her breath hitched as she shone the beam of light directly on it. The figure was of a man, pale and expressionless, his clothes dusty as if he'd been standing there for years. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice wavering. The man didn't respond. He just stared, unmoving. Then in the silence, Julia's flashlight flickered, casting the basement into a quick succession of light and dark. With each flicker, the figure seemed to move closer, without ever taking a step. She turned and ran, but just as she reached the stairs, the lights came back on. She risked a glance back, but the figure was gone. All that remained was a damp old shoe lying where he'd stood, covered in dust and grime, as if it had been there for decades. She left the apartment that night, never to return. There's something terrifying about blackouts. They strip away our security, leaving us vulnerable to the shadows, the silence, and the things we can't explain. These stories remind us that sometimes what we fear in the dark isn't just our imagination, it's something far more sinister, waiting patiently in the silence. Have you ever experienced something unexplainable in the dark? Share your story in the comments below, and if you're brave enough, check out our next video for more spine-chilling tales that will keep you awake long after the lights go out.